Welcome to the webinar. This webinar is part of the Ready, Set, Go, a webinar series that's sponsored by the HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs. My name is Tony Gallo. I work at ICF International, and today I will serve as the moderator of our webinar. As you know, the Ready, Set, Go webinar series is generally held every Tuesday and often on Thursdays, as today. This series provides valuable information and insights for COCs, HMIS administrators, grantees, project sponsors, and other stakeholders on a variety of topics focused on community planning, capacity building, and guidance. So on behalf of SNAPS, I would like to thank you all for joining us today. Today's webinar is called Substantial Amendment Process for Second Allocation of the Fiscal Year 2011 ESG Funds. We're lucky to have three national experts presenting today, Mike Roanhouse, Susan Ziff, and Lindsay Stillman. And in addition, we have two individuals who will be working as resource advisors, and they are Brett Gagnon and Chuck Kiefer. Mike Roanhouse, as most of you know, or if you don't, you should, is the Director of the Program Coordination and Analysis Division at the SNAPS office. He directs the ESG program, helps manage the HPRP program, and oversees policy on the homeless elements of the Consolidated Plan, HMIS, and the point-in-time and housing inventory counts. Susan, also with the SNAPS office, has been HUD's HPRP team lead and is now transitioning to take on the ESG team lead role as well. Lindsay Stillman of the Cloudburst Group conducts training, technical assistance, and evaluation in addition to developing training and guidance materials. She has experience in policy development, continuum of care planning, HMIS implementation, and reporting through her prior role as planning coordinator at Georgia's Housing Trust Fund for the Homeless. Brett Gagnon, who is also with the SNAPS office, has been instrumental in providing assistance in the development of the regulations that are in support of the Hearth Act. And Chuck Kiefer, Director of the Cloudburst Consulting Group, oversees all homeless-related technical assistance and training activities in active partnership with HUD. And he has served in a wide array of practice, policy, planning, research, and training leadership roles in the homeless, housing, and human services arenas for more than 30 years. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I just wanted to make a couple of logistical announcements. Today's webinar will last approximately 90 minutes, and it is being recorded. The webinar recording and PowerPoint presentation is available to you via the chat function on your GoToWebinar toolbar, and they will be posted on the HUD Homelessness Resource Exchange website. Next slide, please. Because of the large size of the audience, all attendees will remain on mute for the duration of the broadcast. And please, for audio, use your telephone handset rather than your computer audio to ensure that participants can hear the webinar as clearly as possible and to avoid feedback. If you do use your telephone handset, that will enable us to use the mute function, whereas if you listen through your computer, we cannot. If you experience any technical difficulty with the audio, video, or both portions of the webcast, please try logging off and then logging back in. That generally helps, but you may also request help using the questions function of the GoToWebinar toolbar. There is a very high volume of participants on today's webinar, and you may experience a lag in how the slides advance. In other words, the presenter may say, "Next slide, please," and begin speaking about that next slide in the presentation before you actually see the new slide on your screen. If this is a problem for you, you might want to print out the slides to follow with the broadcast. Next slide, please. Just a last note, all of your content questions are important to us. However, we will not have time to answer questions live. Please submit your questions as follows. Use the questions function in the GoToWebinar toolbar. You can type your question there, and resource advisors will answer those questions that they have time to get to during this presentation. Many questions regarding ESG have been answered in other venues, such as other webinars, and some of them are available in other materials which are available on the HRE and which will be available in the coming weeks. If you have a question, next slide please, sorry. Next slide please. If you have a question that you didn't submit during the webinar, or one that you submitted but the resource advisors were not able to answer during the duration of the presentation, please submit your question through the HUD HRE virtual help desk at, and the link is provided on the slide, http://hudhre.info.helpdesk. Select Emergency Solutions Grants from the Program System drop-down menu and select the appropriate subtopic. So now it is my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Mike Rowenhouse.
Thanks, Tony, and good afternoon. This webinar is intended to provide an overview to describe the key requirements associated with expending the second allocation of funds, to describe the method for calculating the expenditure limit for emergency shelter and street outreach activities, and to describe the requirements for applying for the second allocation of fiscal year 2011 ESG funds. We are assuming that you have read the substantial amendment notice, so we are not going to track every detail of it. In this webinar, we're going to go through some of the more significant and complex requirements and considerations for this funding. Next slide. On December 5th, 2011, the interim regulation for the Emergency Solutions Grant Program was published. Changes to the Consolidated Plan regulations were released at the same time. The Consolidated Plan webinar presented on November 22nd provided an overview of the changes to the Consolidated Plan regulations that were included in the interim ESG regulations. The purposes of these changes was to align with the con plan with the HUD strategic plan and the federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness, to further align with the continuum of care performance measures, and to ensure consistency with the ESG statutory and regulatory standards. Next slide. $250 million has been authorized for the Emergency Solutions Grant Program for 2011. However, because the Emergency Solutions Grant Program regulations were still being revised when this funding became available, HUD chose to release the funding in a two-stage allocation process. The first allocation of $160 million was made available immediately to avoid a lapse in funding for existing ESG projects. The second allocation of $90 million, which reflects the increase in ESG funding from fiscal year 2010 to fiscal year 2011, was made available to recipients on November 15, 2011, after the ESG interim rule was posted on HUD's website, to ensure that the new money could be used for the program's new eligible activities. To receive funds, recipients must prepare and obtain HUD approval of a substantial amendment to their fiscal year 2011 annual action plan. While the amount of the second allocation was made available to recipients so that they could begin their local planning process, HUD cannot sign grant agreements for the second allocation until HUD approves the substantial amendments. Next slide. As mentioned earlier, recipients must prepare and obtain HUD approval of a substantial amendment to your fiscal year 2011 annual action plan in order to receive the second allocation of ESG funds. The substantial amendment must be prepared in compliance with the revised Consolidated Plan regulations and the current Consolidated Plan Citizen Participation Plan. All recipients must submit their substantial amendment by May 15, 2012. You can, of course, submit it earlier if you have met all the requirements of the regulation and the guidance. Next slide. States must obligate funds within 60 days of the date HUD signs the grant agreement for the second allocation of funds. It's 60 days from the date HUD signed the amendment to the grant agreement. That again, let me restate. States must obligate funds within 60 days of the date HUD signs the grant agreement for the second allocation of funds. It's 60 days from the date HUD signed the amendment to the grant agreement. Then if there are any subrecipients of the state who are local governments and want to further subgrant to nonprofits, they have 120 days from the date the state obligated the funds to them to obligate the funds to any nonprofits, or they can also designate another department within the same unit of general purpose local government to carry out the activities with an internal agreement as the documentation. All grant funds must be spent within 24 months of the date that HUD signed the grant agreement or the amended grant agreement. Next slide. The notice released on January 23rd, 2012 notifies recipients that they will have to submit a substantial amendment to their 2011 action plan. It clarifies some of the requirements from the interim rule that you need to know in order to be able to receive the funds, including providing more detail on establishing the expenditure limits on emergency shelter and street outreach activities with fiscal year 2011 funds. It also goes into detail about what must be included in this substantial amendment. All these requirements are taken from the interim Consolidated Plan regulation. What we did here is lay out it for you clearly in one place. The notice also offers guidance about some of the things that communities will need to consider as they go through their planning process to spend the second allocation of fiscal year 2011 funds and the fiscal year 2012 planning process, which we know most of you are well into. If you have read the notice, one of the things you note that is striking, we hope, is the emphasis on rapid rehousing. We learned a lot from our experience with HPRP, and we know you all did too. We hope these lessons learned can be applied in each community as we move forward with the implementation of the Emergency Solutions Grant Program. For example, research shows that many households who are at risk of losing their housing do not end up becoming literally homeless. And ESG is more tightly targeted than HPRP was, with the income limit of 30% on the homeless prevention assistance. But it's still very difficult to predict who will wind up literally homeless and who would find a way to stay housed. That is why we're emphasizing rapid rehousing so much. Spend the limited funds on housing and stabilizing the people who are already in shelters and on the streets or living out of their cars. We have a real opportunity with this new infusion of ESG funds and with another increase in the 2012 budget funded at $286 million nationwide to make a significant and visible impact on homelessness. The emphasis on rapid rehousing comes straight from HUD leadership. Secretary Donovan is planning to release a video message about the importance of rapid rehousing and the use of ESG funds. We will post this on the HUD HER's site and the HUD website when it is available. Please watch for it. We will announce it over the listserv as well. And now I'm going to pass this over to Susan.
Thanks, Mike. The first major section of the notice is where we go over some of the key requirements for the second allocation and critical decisions that recipients have to make. We included this section because we wanted to emphasize some of the overarching things that recipients and communities need to know and consider as they plan how to spend these funds. One thing that I want to make sure people are clear on before we get into detail is that the primary audience for this webinar is the ESG recipients, which are the metropolitan cities, urban counties, and states that receive allocations of funding directly from HUD. The other people who are on this call who are not ESG recipients. You might be subrecipients or hopeful subrecipients for continuums of care. You should all definitely continue to listen because the substantial amendment process is intended to be a community process, and there is a lot of important information here for everyone. But I wanted to give you a heads up that there is going to be a good amount of detail about the substantial amendment itself and the submission. And also, if you're wondering how you're going to be able to get funding, please know that that's a local process, and HUD can't answer questions about how the local processes work because it's different in every community. We do get questions sometimes on the help desk about that, so just know you've got to talk to your local city, county, or state recipient for more information. Okay, next slide. In the notice, we explain the calculation of the 7.5 administrative cap in great detail, so we're not going to cover it here. We also described it in the introduction to ESG webinar, if any of you saw that, and if you didn't, you can go back and watch the recording that's on the HRE. But what you need to know is that this is a statutory requirement, which means it was in the law that was passed by Congress, and the increase from 5%, which is how it was under the Emergency Shelter Grants Program, was put into place to support the increased strategic planning and program oversight that is required with this new program. Another key consideration is the purposeful shift from simply sheltering people to a focus on permanent housing. If you have read the reg and the preamble to the reg, which I hope you have done, you will see that this is highlighted in that language. But it's also reflected in the expenditure limit on street outreach and emergency shelter activities, which is also statutory, and which we will discuss in greater detail later in this presentation. Next slide. To continue what Mike was saying, the substantial amendment notice does emphasize rapid rehousing because that's how we would like to see communities spend their limited amount of ESG funds. Under HPRP, about 75% of people assisted were helped with homelessness prevention funds, and only about 25% were rapidly rehoused. And I know some of you may have heard me say this before, but we actually were surprised by that percentage. We expected that it would be closer to 50-50 because we assumed that communities would be using these funds to help people get out of shelters and get into permanent housing. Now I understand the various reasons why that happened and why it was the way it was. And one of those reasons was that in some ways prevention is easier to do, and we know that there was a lot of pressure to spend, there is still a lot of pressure to spend the HPRP funds quickly. But I believe that there was also a lot of confusion about how to target the HPRP funds. And you know, a lot of communities ended up creaming or serving people who may not have been the most likely to become homeless. So what we're trying to do here with ESG is be crystal clear. It's a smaller program, and communities should target tightly to use the funds as efficiently as possible. And we also know that there are other resources out there for people who are at risk of becoming homeless that are accessible through mainstream programs that are in communities. So our emphasis is to focus on rapid rehousing. And if some of you do decide to do homelessness prevention, which I know some folks will want to do, then you should work to ensure that that assistance goes to the individuals and families who are truly in crisis, who are the closest to actually living on the streets or going to a shelter. This is Definitely not the last you'll hear from us on this, but essentially in summary, rapid rehousing programs can effectively transition people out of the homeless assistance system quickly, and it is an easier way to ensure that you're targeting emergency shelter resources towards the individuals and families with the most urgent housing crises. As public and nonprofit resources become increasingly strained, rapid rehousing should be given the highest priority under ESG. Next slide, please. Another decision that recipients have to make is whether to reprogram any funds from the first allocation. When we say reprogram, what we mean is that you would take any funds from the first allocation that may have been budgeted but not spent on activities under the Emergency Shelter Grants Program and redesignate or budget them for spending on the new Emergency Solutions Grant activities. So if you do this, we want to make sure that you're aware of 3 key items that are listed on the slide. First, the reprogrammed funds are subject to requirements under the interim rule. Second, if you already have subgrant agreements or contracts in place for subrecipients to spend under the first allocation, make sure that you are in compliance with your own contracts. That is, we're not telling you that you can just illegally break those contracts in order to do this. And our lawyers made us say that. But I do need to make sure that that's clear, that we're recommending reprogramming when you can, but it should not violate existing contracts. And third, the reprogrammed funds must be expended within 24 months after HUD signs the original fiscal year 11 grant agreement that has already been signed in, I believe, most cases. So this is different from the second allocation of funds, which must be expended within 24 months after HUD signs the amended grant agreement. So you want to be sure that you're tracking those funds carefully. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're getting into some material about the expenditure limits. We do go into this in detail in the notice, but we wanted to take a moment and go over it to make sure everyone is clear on it. The interim rule establishes an expenditure limit on emergency shelter and street outreach activities of either 60% of the total fiscal year 11 grant award, meaning both the first and second allocations combined, or the FY10 amount spent on homeless assistance activities, whichever of those two is the greater amount. For most, if not all recipients, the amount of the fiscal year 2010 grant funds committed for homeless assistance activities will be greater than 60% of the recipient's total 2011 ESG grant. And therefore, the majority of recipients will be required to use the entire second allocation of ESG funds on the new activities established under the interim rule. These include rapid rehousing, homelessness prevention, HMIS, and admin. So there might be a few recipients where that's not the case, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. If the fiscal year 2010 homeless assistance amount is greater than 60% of the recipient's total fiscal year 2011 ESG grant, that amount will be the recipient's fiscal year 11 grant expenditure limit for street outreach and emergency shelter activities. Recipients that exceeded this limit in their obligation of funds from the first allocation will not be penalized. However, if a recipient reached or exceeded the limit with the first allocation, the second allocation may only be used for the new homelessness prevention, rapid rehousing, HMIS, and admin activities. In the rare instance that a recipient did not reach the limit with the first allocation, they may use funds from the second allocation for emergency shelter and street outreach activities, as long as the total FY11 grant funds used for those activities does not exceed the limit, and the activities funded under the second allocation comply with the interim rule. So I know it's a little complicated, but that's why we tried to lay it out very clearly in the notice. Next slide. When you are determining the amount of the fiscal year 2010 grant funds committed for homeless assistance activities, note that the amount is based on the funds committed between the date of the FY10 grant agreement and the publication of the interim rule, which was on January 4th, 2012. The evidence for commitments is the same as the evidence for obligation in the interim rule. And we'll talk about, there's another slide coming up that gets into that. And another thing to note is that HUD is defining homeless assistance activities as all activities that would normally be reported as homeless assistance activities in IDIS. So this includes emergency shelter renovation, major rehab, conversion, essential services, maintenance, and operations costs. So a lot of you actually can just use the amounts in IDIS to determine the amount spent with your fiscal year 2010 funds on homeless assistance activities. You might actually remember a listserv that we sent out a couple of months ago, 3-4 months ago, telling ESG recipients that they needed to commit all of their 2010 funds in IDIS. This is what that was about. But we know that there were a few grantees that had some issues in IDIS and things weren't as clear as they needed to be. So that's why we're requiring that you actively tell us in a table format what those commitments are. Next slide. Once you have it all down on the table, recipients must notify the local HUD office of this amount in writing on or before the date that the substantial amendment is submitted. So we provided Table 1 as a suggested format for you to do this, and it's an image of it is included in the notice, and we also included it as an Excel spreadsheet on the HRE, so you can download it there. So then once HUD receives those, the HUD staff are going to verify that the recipient has allocated its total FY11 ESG grant funds in compliance with the limitation on activities related to street outreach and emergency shelter, and they will contact you if there are any issues. And on the next slide, we are going to show you what that table looks like quickly. Just make sure that the amounts of homeless assistance, homelessness prevention, and admin are going to be equal to your total fiscal year 2010 award. Next slide. As I mentioned before, there on the slide are listed the types of evidence that HUD could request. So you need to make sure that you have it available if and when HUD does ask you for this information. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but it summarizes what's written in the notice so you can easily see. One thing to note is that there are slightly different pieces of evidence that are allowed for metropolitan cities, urban counties, and states, so you want to make sure that you read it carefully. And now it's time for the first quiz.
Hi. You should see on your screen a quick poll, and you can use your mouse to click on either true or false. The question is, the expenditure limit for emergency shelter and street outreach is based on fiscal year 2010 homeless assistance activities obligation. So take a moment to answer your question. Okay, so 71% of you answered true and 29% of you answered false. The expenditure limit for the emergency shelter and street outreach is based on the fiscal year 2010 homeless assistance activities obligation, which is true. Now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Lindsay Stillman.
So now we'll discuss the requirements for receiving the second allocation of ESG. We'll be covering a lot of information in a short amount of time, so we won't be able to cover all of the details. So please be sure to thoroughly read the notice and the interim rule to fully understand these requirements. As Susan stated earlier, these requirements apply to recipients, including states, local governments, and territories. So if you are a subrecipient and have questions about your local process, you should consult your recipient directly rather than submitting questions to the help desk, as they will not be able to answer questions about local processes. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, recipients must prepare and obtain HUD approval of a substantial amendment to their 2011 Annual Action Plan in order to receive the second allocation of ESG funds. The substantial amendment must be prepared in compliance with the revised Consolidated Plan regulations and the Citizen Participation Plan that's in your current Consolidated Plan. Please note that HUD will not allow communities to shorten the amount of time for the public comment process. As Mike mentioned, all recipients must submit their substantial amendment by May 15, 2012. Next slide, please. There are a number of sections of the revised interim rule Consolidated Plan regulations that recipients should pay special attention to when they're preparing the substantial amendment. This table is also in the notice. We will discuss each of these components in more detail in the next slide. Next slide, please. The substantial amendment must include the components listed on this slide, and we will describe each of these in more detail over the following slides. In addition, Appendix B in the notice provides a summary checklist of these requirements. Next slide, please. So the first requirement we will discuss is consultation. With the Hearth Act amendment to the McKinney-Vento Act, jurisdictions are now required to consult with each continuum of care that serves the jurisdiction's geographic area, as well as other entities, when creating their homeless strategy and resource allocation. The goal of these changes is to create a direct connection between the Consolidated Plan and the continuum of care process, as well as to increase access to mainstream services for people that are experiencing homelessness. The requirement also reflects congressional direction to promote greater collaboration between the ESG recipients and the continuums of care. In addition to the continuum of care, the jurisdictions must consult with a number of different entities when preparing the strategy to address homelessness, and more detail about these entities is in the interim rule. Next slide, please. Within the substantial amendment, the recipients must provide a description of how they have consulted with the continuum of care in order to determine the allocation of ESG assistance, the development of written performance standards, and the development of funding, policies, and procedures for operating and administering HMIS. Some examples of appropriate consultation with the continuum of care could include formal meetings with continuum of care leadership, creating joint work groups, or soliciting written input from COC stakeholders. Next slide, please. The next requirement we'll discuss is citizen participation. As mentioned earlier, recipients must follow the citizen participation plan that's outlined in their current consolidated plan. In addition, recipients must ensure they meet the new citizen participation requirements that are in the interim rule, which specify additional organizations that must participate. These include local and regional institutions, the continuum of care, and additional organizations. In the substantial amendment, recipients should provide a description of the citizen participation process that was used, and this description should include also efforts to broaden participation, comments that were received, and a discussion of which comments were and were not accepted. Next slide, please. All recipients must match the entire amount of the second allocation. Within your substantial amendment should specify the types, amounts, and proposed uses of these matching resources. Please note that this requirement does not apply to territories. States should note that the matching requirement is established on the entire fiscal year 2011 ESG grant so the exception of the first 100,000 was applied to the first allocation. So they are required to match 100% of the second allocation. But in fiscal year 2012 and beyond, states will be exempt from matching the first 100,000. More details on matching requirements are in the interim rule. Next slide, please. So match can be cash or non-cash resources. It can also include match that was provided prior to the second allocation, as long as it was used and reported in accordance with the new rules requirements, and it was spent on eligible activities. You may also use federal funds as match as long as it's allowable under the other program rules and you are not using ESG as match for that program. Because the expenditure limits don't apply to the match, HUD encourages recipients to use match to support the increased planning and oversight responsibilities. Next slide, please. So within the substantial amendment, recipients must also describe all of the activities that are planned using the second allocation of funds. In addition, if you plan to reprogram any first allocation funds, you must describe how these will be used. The notice provides additional details about what items must be included in this description, as well as several suggested formats for providing that description. Next slide, please. The substantial amendment should also include an explanation of the decisions that you made. So why you chose to fund certain activities at the levels that you chose. HUD would like you to provide a justification for these decisions. So for example, if you chose to do homelessness prevention, they want to know why. Was it based on experience with HPRP, availability of experienced providers, or local data on needs, etc.? Recipients should also describe the local objectives and priority needs that will be addressed with the proposed activities, as well as proposed accomplishments. It's important to use locally relevant data to support your priorities if at all possible, and your COC could be one potential source for that local data. In addition, recipients should highlight the connection of local objectives to the national strategic priorities in opening doors. And finally, you must also describe potential obstacles to addressing underserved needs in your community. Next slide, please. Recipients need to include a detailed budget of planned activities and the funding level. The budget must account for the entire second allocation and any reprogrammed funds for the first allocation. HUD has provided a format for this with Table 3. And you'll notice that Table 3 asks for the budget by specific activity. Also, you should note that Table 3 assumes that recipients will be obligating the entire second allocation and any reprogrammed funds to new activities. So if you are proposing funds for shelter outreach and you are eligible to do so, you should contact your local HUD field office for more guidance. Next slide, please. So this is Table 3, the detailed budget table, and recipients can download this as an Excel spreadsheet on HUD HRE. So I'm not going to go through the details of the table, but the slide provides an idea of what it looks like. It has embedded calculations in it as well to make it easier to complete. You should note that the table does call out project-based rental assistance and tenant-based rental assistance. And the reason for this is it will help HUD to determine the extent of environmental review that will be required, since project-based assistance requires a higher level of environmental review because the assistance is tied to the unit and not to the tenant. Next slide, please. So the next few slides we're going to talk about the types of written standards that will be required in the substantial amendment. Next slide. In the substantial amendment, jurisdictions are required to describe the written standards that they will use for administering ESG. You should note that states can either describe their own standards or they may choose to describe the requirements that they will place on subrecipients to establish and implement written standards. HUD recognizes that these standards may not currently exist, so they encourage recipients to create initial standards for the substantial amendment, building from HPRP experience, and then to revisit and revise these standards over time in preparation for the 2012 action plan and beyond. HUD realizes that recipients are going to be in a rush to get the substantial amendments approved by the local governing bodies, city councils, etc., and that the written standards may take time to develop fully. So the notice encourages recipients to establish initial standards for the purposes of the amendment and to continue refining the standards over future annual action plans. So this does not mean that you can submit junk and it will get approved, but what it means is that HUD expects that you will be put some real thought into the initial submission, and then as you learn more, you can improve these standards over time. The policies and procedures developed for HPRP may be a good place to start, but HUD does expect that you will use the lessons learned from HPRP to inform the new policies and procedures, especially recognizing that HPRP and ESG rules are different in many ways. The substantial amendment is just one process for refining the HPRP policies and procedures and to put more effective ones in place for ESG. Next slide, please. So this slide provides an overview of all the written standards that must be described within the substantial amendment. Each of these standards will be discussed individually over the next few slides and are discussed in more detail within the notice. So again, HUD is expecting you to use what you learned from HPRP to create these and then to adjust any existing policies and procedures as appropriate. Next slide. Okay. For the first standard, recipients must describe the standard policies and procedures they will use for evaluating each family or individual's eligibility for assistance under ESG. For example, you could develop a standardized assessment form that all intake workers will be required to use. These standards may be described generally, but you should get into at least some level of detail about the processes that you plan to implement. The policies and procedures that you describe must be consistent with the definitions of homeless and at risk of homelessness, as well as the record-keeping requirements within the interim rule. Next slide, please. So this standard is fairly self-explanatory. Recipients must describe how they and their subrecipients will coordinate and integrate ESG-funded activities with other homeless assistance programs and mainstream services and housing. The interim rule provides a detailed list of these types of programs. So this coordination and integration should help you to provide a strategic community-wide system to prevent and end homelessness. The required coordination and integration may either be done over the entire area covered by a continuum of care or a larger area over which services are coordinated. Next slide, please. So recipients must also describe policies and procedures that pertain to which individuals or families will receive rapid rehousing assistance and which will receive homelessness prevention assistance. So recognizing that the amount of funds available will most likely not be enough to serve everyone that's eligible, the policies and procedures should really articulate how individuals and families who are eligible to receive assistance will be prioritized. In other words, how are subrecipients and case managers going to determine who should get assistance when everyone shows up asking for help? Jurisdictions should consider how the policies and priorities can serve as many homeless people as possible with rapid rehousing assistance, including those individuals and families that have multiple barriers to housing. So an individual or family's ability to sustain housing shouldn't be a program goal, not a threshold for eligibility.
Lindsay, I wanted to take 1 second and talk about that statement. That statement was included as a response to what we learned under HPRP, which is that some people under HPRP thought that the ability to sustain housing was an eligibility requirement and that people had to demonstrate future stability in order to receive help now. So that's not that's not what HUD intended, and I know there was a lot of discussion about it. But in fact, what ultimately ended up happening is that in some cases, the very people who needed HPRP help the most weren't able to get it because they had lost a job and couldn't demonstrate that they were going to be able to become sustainable in the future. So with the ESG, we want to be very clear that the ability to sustain housing is just a future target or outcome goal to be achieved from the assistance, not an eligibility criteria.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. Also related to this written standard, recipients should also describe the risk factors that you'll use to determine which individuals and families most in need of homelessness prevention assistance in order to avoid becoming homelessness. So as Susan and Mike discussed, because predicting which families and individuals will become homeless but for ESG assistance is very difficult, HUD is encouraging recipients to target assistance to families and individuals that are closest to becoming homelessness, so going to a shelter, car, or the street, if not those who are about to spend their first night there, which is often referred to as diversion. So recipients should really try to use good local data to identify what those characteristics are in their community, including the characteristics that are typical of the homeless individuals and families in their community. These characteristics should really serve as a guide for targeting homelessness prevention assistance to those that are most in need. Next slide, please. Recipients must also describe the guidelines for determining a program participant's contribution to rent and utilities while they're receiving assistance. So recipients and subrecipients do not have to require participants' contribution, but if you aren't going to require contribution, you just explain that. If you are going to require a contribution, you'll need to explain how you'll determine the amount of that contribution. So if you're going to require different contributions for different participants, that's also fine, but your procedures for determining the amount they must pay must be defensible and transparent. You should really consider the challenges associated with homelessness in your specific community when developing these guidelines, as well as other resources that are available or lacking in the community and the existing housing and economic conditions in the community. And it's important to stress that recipients are able to be flexible and consider a wide range of options. So examples could be providing a fixed amount of assistance per person, adjusting the assistance over time on a fixed scale, or requiring participants to pay a certain portion of their income over the course of the assistance. So the guidelines selected, though, should really fit the realities of that local community. Next slide, please. Recipients must also describe the guidelines for determining the length and amount of assistance that a participant will receive, including changes in assistance amounts over time. So this is similar to the prior written standard in that your policies and procedures need to be clear and defensible. You also must ensure that your guidelines don't violate any regulatory requirements. So again, it's important to consider local challenges and resources as well as housing and economic conditions when you're determining these guidelines. Next slide, please. Recipients must also describe the process for determining the types and amounts of housing stabilization and relocation services that will be provided, as well as the length of time a participant can receive services. So the description should include limits above and beyond HUD requirements that will be imposed if there are any. Again, recipients are able to be flexible and consider a wide range of options within the 24-month assistance cap. So they could choose to provide a predetermined set of services per program participant or adjust services over time based on a set of indicators. Next slide, please. So the next requirement refers to the process for making subawards. So within the substantial amendment, recipients must describe the process that they will use to make the subawards. This description should include the review and award process, as well as how awards will be made available to nonprofit organizations and local units of government. Next slide, please. So in addition, in the substantial amendment, the local governments, not states, must address the homeless participation requirement. So each recipient, excluding states, must provide for the participation of not less than one homeless individual or formerly homeless individual on the board of directors or other equivalent policymaking entity to the extent that the entity considers and makes policies and decisions regarding any facilities, services, or other assistance funded with ESG. And this requirement is statutory and remains the same as it was in the prior ESG regulations. However, what has changed is the interim rule recognizes that many of the policymaking entities of ESG recipients can only consist of elected officials. So therefore, they recognize that that many recipients may not be able to meet this participation requirement. So if a recipient is not able to meet the participation requirement, they must develop and implement a plan to consult with homeless or formerly homeless individuals when considering and making policies and decisions regarding any ESG-funded facilities, services, or other assistance. So if you do not currently meet the homeless participation requirement, the recipient must describe their plan for addressing that in the substantial amendment. Next slide, please. Now, within the substantial amendment, the recipient must describe the performance standards that will be used to evaluate ESG activities. And note that these standards must be developed in consultation with the continuum of care per the interim rule. And similar to the written standards, HUD really recognizes that these standards will evolve over the next few years, especially as ESG recipients and subrecipients have increasing access to HMIS data and as they become more integrated with the continuum of care in their geographic area. But currently, in developing the performance standards for the substantial amendment, recipients should look to the continuum of care performance measures that were outlined in the HARS Act and develop performance standards for the ESG activities that can complement or contribute to these measures. In future years, each COC will be responsible for measuring the performance of ESG recipients within its geographic boundaries against these performance standards. And HUD will be providing additional guidance on performance measurement, including the use of HMIS data in future guidance documents. Next slide, please. In addition, a new certification form will be provided by HUD for submission by all recipients. And this slide includes a list of some of the certifications that are new or have changed. But for more information on any specific certification, please refer to the interim rule. Next slide, please. So the next requirement really only applies if a recipient plans to obligate second allocation funds to emergency shelter or street outreach activities and is eligible to do so. So this may not apply to many of you. So if they are planning and eligible to obligate second allocation funds to emergency shelter or street outreach activities, the recipient must describe additional written standards in their substantial amendment. So local governments and territories must describe standards that will be used to target and provide any of the essential services related to street outreach, policies and procedures used by emergency shelters in regards to admission, diversion, referral, and discharge by any shelters, including standards for length of stay, safeguards for special populations, and strategies for serving high-need populations or individuals or families with highest barriers to housing. And finally, policies and procedures for assessing and prioritizing the needs of individuals and families that are receiving essential services related to emergency shelter. And these policies and procedures should also include a process for reassessing individuals and families' needs for essential services while in emergency shelter. Please note that HUD will not approve any emergency shelter or street outreach activities proposed in the substantial amendment until a description of these written standards is provided. Next slide, please. So as with the previous written standards, states must either describe their own standards, identical to the ones I just described, or they must describe the requirements for subrecipients to establish those standards. And for both local governments and states, note that if you're not proposing emergency shelter or street outreach, you do not need to include these standards in the substantial amendment. But you should be aware that they will be required in future annual action plans, so you could begin planning for those now. Next slide, please. So an additional requirement that may not apply to all recipients is that the interim rule provides an opportunity to expand the eligibility of at-risk based on local criteria through the definition of criteria of otherwise lives in housing that has characteristics associated with instability and an increased risk of homelessness as identified in the recipient's approved consolidated plan. So more information about that criteria is provided in the interim rule. However, if you just choose to serve individuals or families that are at risk of homelessness based on your locally defined criteria or characteristics, you have to describe those characteristics in your substantial amendment. And please note that the characteristics that you select really should be evidenced by the characteristics and needs of individuals and families that are currently entering the homeless assistance system or the street. Again, if a recipient does not describe these characteristics in their substantial amendment, they cannot serve individuals and families using this criteria of the at-risk of homelessness definition. Next slide, please. So there are also several additional components of the substantial amendment which you would only need to include by choice or under certain situations. Next slide, please. Although recipients are not currently required to participate in a centralized or coordinated assessment system until HUD provides additional standards to continuums of care through the publication of the COC program rule, some communities have already established some such systems. So if your jurisdiction or a portion of the jurisdiction currently has a centralized or coordinated assessment system which is utilized by the recipient or subrecipient, you should describe that system in your substantial amendment. Next slide, please. And finally, HUD would like to note that the Consolidated Plan requires recipients to describe standards and procedures that the jurisdiction will use to monitor activities that are carried out in furtherance of the plan and to ensure long-term compliance with the requirements of the program. So because the interim ESG rule introduces a number of substantial changes to activities and procedures, HUD is really encouraging recipients to review and update their monitoring standards and procedures within the substantial amendment. You want to ensure that these standards and procedures will allow you to monitor compliance with these new requirements as well as associated requirements for appropriate levels of staffing. And HUD has found in the past that recipients that dedicate staff to monitoring compliance and carrying out other administrative tasks are better able to implement and assure compliance with large programmatic changes. So this will help really prevent future monitoring findings by HUD for non-compliance. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Tony for another quiz.
And before I do that, Susan wanted to clarify something from the previous quiz.
Thank you, Tony. We got some questions over the chat feature about that first quiz, and I wanted to clarify it. The question was, the expenditure limit for emergency shelter and street outreach is based on the FY2010 Homeless Assistance Activities Obligation, true or false? And we said the answer is true, but you could actually read it in some way, and I will chalk this one up to the fact that these questions have a character limit on them, so we weren't able to get into as much detail on that as we would have liked in the question. The answer is actually that the expenditure limit for 2011 is based on the greater of 60% of the 2011 grant or the amount of the 2010 funds obligated for homeless assistance activities. So I think either way you read it, if, true or false, you were right. So we apologize, that was a little bit misleading. Now let's try it again for the second quiz. Go ahead, Tony.
Great, Susan. Thank you. Okay, so select true or false. The budget in the substantial amendment should only account for the planned uses of the second allocation of funds. I'll give you a few seconds. Okay, so the majority of you answered false, which is correct. It is false because you need to make sure that if you reprogram any funds, you will also include the planned uses of these funds in the budget. So it's not only the second allocation, it's the second allocation plus any reprogrammed funds. This is one of the tricky things about reprogramming these funds, documenting how each of the dollars will be used differently for the new ESG activities.
Okay, let's talk about the requirements that apply to the fiscal year 2011 and future con plan submissions. So I know that you all have a lot of questions about your FY12 annual action plan process. And I just want to tell you that I don't expect that we're going to be able to answer most of your questions. Pretty much what was in the substantial amendment notice is what we can say about it. We've actually gotten a lot of questions over the help desk and on this, even on this webinar so far about combining your 2011 and 12 funds. And I want to make clear that every ESG grantee has to do a substantial amendment in order to receive the 2011 second allocation of funds. And it's a substantial amendment to your 2011 con plan action plan. And you want to make sure that you're following the obligation expenditure deadlines for each allocation of FY11 and 12. I know it's really tricky because the process has kind of got delayed, and so everything is going on all at once. So I know it's definitely a challenge for you. But know that we are going to be issuing guidance to field offices and out to provide as much information as we can as you go through this process. So on the next slide, what we can tell you is what's in the interim rule, like I said. So to receive fiscal year 2012 funds and in the future, all con plan jurisdictions, even those that did not receive ESG funds, will be required to comply with all of the revised requirements. So they'll need to make sure that make sure you're reading the con plan rule and the ESG rule, whether or not you're going to get ESG funds. Also, if you submitted your consolidated plan, housing and homeless needs assessments, housing market analysis, and strategic plan before January 4th, 2012, you will not be required to resubmit it. But if you do have one coming up that's due soon, you want to make sure that it includes the Emergency Solutions Grant Program requirements, because those were effective as of January 4th. Next slide, please. Another hot topic that I know a lot of people have questions about is paper and reporting for the new ESG program. The new ESG-specific reporting requirements are going to apply to activities included in the substantial amendment, and there will be new reporting requirements required of all con plan jurisdictions as well. And right now, we are in the midst of working out exactly what those are, and we have to put them through the Paperwork Reduction Act process through OMB. So that is a process that involves public input. So you guys should be on the lookout to see those coming through, and you will know, hopefully there will be no surprises about what is going to be included in these in reporting for for the Emergency Solutions Grant. Like I said, we're going to be providing additional guidance as soon as we can. All right, on the next slide, we're moving into next steps. And then actually the next slide after that. In closing, we want to just remind everyone that while the planning process for developing the FY2011 substantial amendment is critical, recipients should approach it as the first step in an ongoing comprehensive planning process. We also know that 4 months to do the substantial amendment is going to be a tight turnaround for some folks. We recognize that, but just know that we expect you to implement as much as you can and everything that's required in the best format that you can do in 4 months. And like we said earlier, we expect that it will be an ongoing process to plan for the best use of these funds in your community over time. Next slide, please. And then I think as we've referred to before, in all jurisdictions, substantive discussions with the COC representatives and other organizations should be beginning very soon. So it's going to be an active community process, and coordination and collaboration with all the key stakeholders is going to be critical. And with that, I'll hand it over to Tony to close it out.
Thank you, Susan. There are a number of additional guidance documents that are available specific to the CON-Plan regulations, and some of this guidance is already available on the HRE, and others will be available in the near future. Next slide, please. Resources on the HRE will eventually include all of the following. User guides, McKinney-Vento Act as amended by the Hearth Act, and everything that is listed on this slide. So HUD is producing a number of user guides highlighting key changes in the new ESG regulation, and will alert communities when these anticipated resources become available. In addition to the user guides, we also anticipate that the HRE will provide a range of additional resources. We will alert communities when these resources become available. Next slide, please. Just to summarize, you should now be able to understand the basic requirements for receiving the second allocation of fiscal year 2011 ESG funds, describe the key requirements associated with spending the second allocation, and lastly, describe how to calculate the expenditure limit for emergency shelter and street outreach activities. So please take a few moments to complete the online survey to let us know how well this webinar achieved its objectives, and we will use your feedback to help improve future webinars. So with that, I want to thank you for participating in today's webinar, and I hope you have a nice rest of the afternoon. Thank you.